GMG, and welcome to another Touchgrass podcast episode. KG, we are becoming the home of DATs. We've had Sharplink on, we've had Charlie Lee on earlier talk about Lite Strategy. Today we have the man from Lite Strategy himself. Jay, welcome on.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me. It's not a bad space to kind of get into, that's for sure.
It is an awesome space to get into. Just to sort of give context to our viewers, can you talk a little bit about your background and Lite Strategy? And then we can sort of get into a lot more of the questions we have for you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's one of the I think unique things about dads is you're taking something old and making something new, and I think my background is very reflective of that. So yeah, I'm currently the CEO and CFO. I wear two hats at Lite Strategy, Nasdaq listing LITS. So I probably will say it multiple times, and have about 25 years of experience, going closer to 30 now, on various accounting and finance. Started in public accounting back in the day, and overall corporate leadership across tech industry. Moved into biotech, med tech, molecular diagnostics when that was really starting to kick off, women's health, contraception, and then eventually oncology, and then moving into that space with Litecoin and digital assets in July of last year. So, I mean, it's not necessarily something career-wise that I thought I'd necessarily get into, but then I never thought biotech would be something I'd necessarily get into. But it's a very kind of San Diego thing. San Diego's, I don't know if you've gentlemen been, very transitionary. It's kind of go with the flow. The sun's always out, can't complain. So you just kind of have to go where the tide's taking you. No pun intended with the beach, but maybe a little.
Yeah.
But it's a great entrance into the crypto space, and I still get to actually manage some of my biotech roots too, with kind of what our structure is. So, yeah, we started with Litecoin as a treasury asset in July of last year. Became CEO and board member November, permanent CEO in November of 25. And we're the first U.S. publicly listed, and actually still only one in the U.S. to adopt Litecoin as its primary reserve asset. We deployed $100 million in just over 900,000 of Litecoin to launch our digital asset strategy, kind of in the middle of last year. And we still are the largest institutional holder and accumulator of Litecoin.
Yes, sir. Can you talk to me a little bit about sort of this transition from the biotech world to now becoming a DAT? Like, I want to ask you, like, is it different being like the C-suite of a biotech company versus being the CEO of a crypto DAT? But I think the first primary question is, how was that transition internally from, hey, we're in the biotech world to now we're a crypto DAT?
Yeah, great question. For the company as a whole, and kind of how the board got involved, it was a decided and a very calculated pivot. It wasn't just a random decision. So it was, and happy to go into that into more detail. But as far as my background itself, as I said, I'm coming up on 30 years of experience, and the last 15 or so in navigating regulated public markets as a public company CFO in particular. So tons of capital market exposure. It's one big thing is raising capital. You get very good at it in the biotech space. I think one of my largest raises was well over $100 million. Lots of M&A work, working with institutional stakeholders, obviously lots of board governance. Not to mention just with a very disciplined and proven fiscal responsibility and oversight, lots of cash management, right? You're always watching your cash. And this is very important with DATs too, as you're trying to maximize operations to really ensure the long-term success of what your digital asset strategy is. And that's what a DAT needs, a very strong financial leader and a good executive presence. So I think, while it's got a biotech background, I've got tons of finance experience and that C-suite experience. It transitions extremely well into a regulated crypto company. And I'm already seeing a lot of those factors play into it as we really see what our future holds and the path that we're going to be taking going forward. I've said this before to other people that have asked me, friends, family. I think the big thing, and this biotech into the crypto space, as long as you are extremely flexible, you're curious, inquisitive and ask questions, you get to meet a ton of fascinating people, so much knowledge and so much insight. And that's one of the exciting things. It's just kind of continuing to learn even after I've been doing this for so long.
That's super interesting. You know, like for someone you say biotech, crypto, they probably think those are two different worlds. But as you're kind of laying it out one by one, it feels like the skill set to manage or succeed in both industries at the top level are similar in some sense. But I would think that your interaction with the crypto community, people on crypto Twitter, is completely different from in the biotech sphere. So what was that initial kind of interaction been like when you first joined? And is there something that stood out? Whoa, that's surprising, kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a great question, and there are kind of, you take a step back to and you think about it in the biotech world, you do there's a lot of strategic advisory board work too, because you're dealing with very complex medical pharmaceutical issues. The last thing MEI was working on before we pivoted into that was in oncology, so we had a lot of a chief medical officer who was a brilliant man. Still work with him a little bit. So you work with these type of people, and that is kind of how we've built the DAT strategy too. So, you mentioned Charlie. Charlie's amazing. We can talk about him anytime. He's amazing to work with. We've got a great team at GSR too. Happy to talk about them. But there definitely is a bit of a change. So, when we first started kicking off and looking for these strategic alternatives, of which the DAT process ended up being the winner, was really kind of around the mid 24 timeline. At that time, the biotech industry, there weren't a lot of great opportunities for us to do something like a reverse merger with, and really use our entity to kind of continue on with as we were winding down operations from our prior clinical ops. And not to mention, in 2024, the capital markets were just locked up in biotech. There was just no deals going on. So we opened up things to other industries. And that's when we were approached by Titan Capital, who had done several of these DATs last year. And were approaching us for looking to be the first Litecoin DAT. And Charlie Lee was already lined up. And like I said, GSR was already lined up as a treasury management arm when they made the pitch. We were a great vehicle for it. We had a lot of cash, like almost 20 million on our books, no debt, winded down clinical operations, a very, very lean staff. We're a virtual office. So we had a lot of pluses, and we could basically power things back up if the pitch was successful. And so lo and behold, we went on a roadshow, and in 3 days raised $100 million, which I've done successful roadshows before in the biotech space, but they usually take a little bit longer than 3 days. But the draw of having Charlie on the board and being an advisor, and some of the investment institutions that came on board, and we talked to some small offices up to larger institutions, very much a much more casual kind of vibe, very inquisitive. They're very eager to see Charlie come on board is a big selling point. And he's got a huge fan base. I know he was on your show, you mentioned it, so you get it, right? Charlie's just kind of got this aura around him, and he's been an amazing advisor, and confident, and someone I'm pretty lucky to have him on my phone contact list, to say the least, and amongst people on the GSR side too. So it's been just kind of it was an interesting shotgun. Let me tell you, it happened all very quick. It was almost like, wow, what the heck just happened, right? But it's been a great learning curve, and I've got some fantastic individuals to work with. But again, it equates, right? I had a strategic advisory board in the biotech side. Now I have that on the digital asset side too. We're all working in hand to really push forward Litecoin and the Litecoin ecosystem.
And Jay, can you talk to us about like when you learned about Litecoin for the first time, or like when this opportunity arose with GSR and Titan Capital? What sort of attracted the original company towards Litecoin and agreeing to do this? Like, what was the thought process there?
Yeah, no, that's another great question, because that's definitely something we discussed amongst the board, because like I said, during 2025, there were a lot of DATs that got off the board. I want to say, geez, I know there was maybe over 70 or so that got out last year. There was a lot, right? So the thing was, a lot of those didn't necessarily have kind of a niche vibe to it. And that was one of the things that really made it kind of very interesting to the board. And I think looking back and evaluating what I know now versus what I knew then is, and I can kind of put it in words a little bit better, is Litecoin's latent on-chain value. And so that kind of comes from a lot of different things, right? It's kind of a nebulous comment, but I can kind of quantify it a little bit now that I've got more experience in it a little bit. So itself, Litecoin is this, it's been around for a long time, since 2011, 14, plus years. It's secure, it's reliable, it's scalable, it has lowest transaction fees, and it's much faster settlement than Bitcoin. It's got a fixed number, it's got the 84 million, so it's got the scarcity. And it also has the privacy options too that everyone wants at their availability. So the question though is, why hasn't more been developed into it? And that's kind of where I get into the latent value. So if you take a step back, with all of those pluses, why is the network capacity and the structure there to really kind of lean into that and have that utility really be activated by some of the application developers and users? Now, that is happening now, and we're on the early part of it. So that was a huge benefit to us to get in early. As I mentioned, it's one of the older cryptocurrencies that is around there. Everyone talks about it being the digital silver to Bitcoin's digital gold, but that is true, right? Digital gold, Bitcoin, accumulation, hold it, right? You're not going to be out transacting it. But with the silver aspect, it's meant to be used. It's meant to be transactional. It's meant to be used on a daily basis. So I think that there is a degree of utilization that still hasn't there, but it's now starting to be developed. The privacy with MWeb coming out and that optionality that people can look for. You've kind of got the best of both worlds there. I think people are looking to ensure that they have the necessary privacy in place, as they should, but maybe the network itself isn't fully supportive of giving it something that the people really want. Well, now Litecoin has that; it can have that at your disposal. So, I think ultimately, the way that we looked at it is, no one has done this with Litecoin. It is an N of one. We can really lean into it. We're ahead of the curve before a lot of this gets rolled out. It can even be seen as complementary to Bitcoin to some degree. And I think, and just to be optimistic on it, I think you can't deny that there is just latent value in Litecoin as well. Obviously, we're not at the highs it had experienced before, but even if you go back into the early 2000s or 2010s, 20s, and right around there, sorry, the value is residing there, and I think that there is definitely potential once you start unlocking that you could potentially see a really nice run on Litecoin as well. And needless to say, I think we're well positioned to take advantage of that too.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, when we had Charlie on the pod, this like early January, like Q1 this year, he talked a lot about like hard money principles as well. Was that also part of the conversations when you were talking to Charlie or talking to investors in general?
Oh, absolutely. We hear it a lot because Litecoin is very unique in that sense, and I'm glad you mentioned Charlie because he definitely ties into that. And this is something that he gets asked a lot, and specifically, when people are looking for those hard money principles, you look at fixed cap supply like gold, that there is no central authority that can basically inflate the supply. There's the proof of work, the fact that it takes real energy to produce and secure the network, right? There's a huge computer algorithm that it takes to mine Litecoin, so there's security in that. It was a very fair launch. There was no pre-mine, there's no VC money, there's no insider advantages. Even Charlie himself sold his holdings to avoid potential conflicts of interest down the road. I mean, who else can say that, right? That's how hard he believes in Litecoin. And it really shows in how it's taken over in the 14 track record of security and reliability. I mean, these are all fundamental aspects that people want in their hard money principles. Plus, I've alluded to it, but you can't underestimate how it's optimized for payments. It's got transactional speed. It's got the low fees. It's basically super practical for making payments. So it makes sense as a hard money aspect because it's a great use for the low fee, quick finalization of payments aspect. Mention the privacy. That's something else someone wants with hard money, and the ability to transact without fear of where it has been in the past. People don't worry about it with cash. I got a $20 bill from you. That should be the same thing. I shouldn't worry where my $20 worth of Litecoin came from as well. So if you kind of combine all of these aspects into kind of a conglomeration of properties, you get something that looks more like a sound money, hard money principle than I think anything else in crypto. Something that's optimized for circulation. It's fast, cheap, and proven. I think it ticks all the boxes.
100%. I think when the whole DAT craze was happening, to understand assets and to understand these new equity versions of digital assets, the selling point has to be super simple. So when you say digital silver, digital gold, I think the institutional investor or the TradFi people, it'll be more resonating with them. And that's what even I have kind of seen over the I don't know, I think 120 DATs came out since last year. And most of them,
crazy number.
Yeah, it's a crazy number. But Jay, one of the questions that we usually get from, I talk to a lot of traders, investors who watch these new DATs come up to raise billions of dollars. And one of the questions usually I see on Twitter and even some of our conversations is, how are these DATs executing with that capital? How are they buying these tokens? And because everyone follows Michael Saylor and Strategy, how they're doing it every week, but some of these other DATs with other assets, how are they executing it? Any insight you can give us?
Yeah, it's interesting. You don't necessarily want to lead or follow the lead of the head pony, right? And I think there's a lot of variability that can be ultimately implemented by some of these DATs. And Litecoin in itself, what we're focused on, especially, we can carve out our own niche. And that really is kind of what our approach is once we really kind of lean into this and really figured out what our path forward is. And let me explain that a little bit better. So I think, overall, any buying strategy itself combines a programmatic discipline and you really need some market expertise, right? So overall, and again, as a publicly traded company, our activities are meant ultimately to drive shareholder value. Not a big surprise. And we are committed to supporting the Litecoin ecosystem and Litecoin as a token itself. They're not mutually exclusive in our eyes. They're both something that we want to see move forward. So ultimately, we tell ourselves inside that, what do we need to do to be a disciplined DAT versus something we call a distracted DAT. So let me kind of explain what I mean by that. So, just starting a little bit earlier in the year, and we're a 6/30 year end, so we're actually into our third quarter now, just started here in April. This ultimately means for us utilizing our capital and our Litecoin balance to transform it into a productive reserve asset. And I even mentioned that in one of our quarterly press releases a quarter or two ago. And what that means for us is we're deploying our Litecoin assets in a way to generate additional income through covered call options. We've also implemented a share repurchase program that we can use, which can ultimately benefit investors by potentially kind of smoothing out any sort of market volatility. That also helps support the LTC ecosystems because we're kind of active traders in it. We can raise capital. We can buy back stock. We can generate option income. We We can leverage our holdings. We can make strategic investments, and we can create NAV premium through skillful capital allocations. And that does differentiate us from ETFs, these passive vehicles that basically are following a strict accumulate and hold proposition and have static LTC holdings, right? They just can't do all of those aspects in it. So what we are trying to do is ultimately, yes, we've got our initial buy, and that is our overall long strategy. But now we're looking for opportunities. How do we deploy this in such a way that has the ultimate benefit for Litecoin in its ecosystem in general? How can we continue to move it forward? So, it takes a lot of expertise. That's why I mentioned we're continuing to work with GSR. They're one of the largest crypto market makers. It just made sense to align operations with them. We brought Josh Reisman, who's their chief legal and strategy officer, I believe. He sits on our board too. I know that title is relatively new. He's amazing. And the whole team at GSR, fantastic group of individuals. And they're really helping us shape this whole kind of approach. So overall, we're much more about what can we do with Litecoin to push the ecosystem forward, right? I might as well get it printed on a t-shirt and wear it around. But we're all about what we can do to benefit Litecoin and push it forward, which is one of the reasons why, Litecoin Foundation and having Charlie on our board are such a key. We're all aligned in ultimately making Litecoin even more acceptable and used as a hard money component.
That makes sense, Jay. And I would assume you would have to work really closely with like the Litecoin Foundation and other Litecoin ecosystem entities and GSR. Like how does this collaboration sort of work? Can you explain what the Litecoin Foundation might help with, or what the GSR team might help with, and how you sort of balance between all these different parties?
Yeah, because you do have to have somewhat of a little bit of a Chinese wall in there, but they are available to us. Charlie is an advisor as well as sitting on our board. Obviously, creator of Litecoin. Couldn't ask for another, a better person to sit on your board. And he's also, managing director of the Litecoin Foundation. And it's a very direct and active relationship. I more often than not talk to him every week. They obviously see a lot of interesting things come across their desk, and Charlie will share those with me and the board as they come across for potential opportunities. We do, we try and also use those connections to do additional outreach and make additional connections. We've gotten to know the guys over at LitVM, Litecoin Virtual Machine. Working with them and some great resources. We did Charlie and I did a Spaces last Friday, a week ago Friday with them. A great discussion on Litecoin, and a lot of very kind of collaborative people kind of jumped in, and it was just very Litecoin forward conversation. It was a very good one. And then obviously the Litecoin Summit. I don't know if you guys are going. That's in June up in Amsterdam. I'll be going there with Charlie. Josh will be there. We'll probably get to do a couple panels and other things as well with some other key players. So that is kind of one big aspect that we're really pulling into is just the connections. GSR itself, I literally cannot say enough good words about that. It is a very deep partnership. They are effectively our treasury management arm. I work with 3 to 4 individuals on various different aspects to help manage our Litecoin positions and any sort of the implementation of our active treasury management strategy that we're doing, of course, during the week, and also kind of the broader sense too. Where are the opportunities? Josh himself brings over 2 decades of legal and financial service experience with his background. And I think ultimately through GSR, Litz has this almost like institutional grade infrastructure and not just a retail operation, and can be very nimble and we can move very quickly. And needless to say, between Charlie and Josh and GSR, we hear a lot of things maybe before a lot of other people on the street will. So we're definitely at the forefront of really pushing the ecosystem forward.
100%. Jay, like we always kind of ask about, what are dads doing differently, and also where are we headed? And I think you said in July, that's when Lite Strategy started, and it's been almost a year since this whole craze kind of began. And obviously, Sale has been doing it for much longer. But
Yeah.
what's like the level of reception and interest? Obviously, you're working with different institutions, but it's been a year. What's like the reception and feedback, or what's like the institutional scene like? Are they still interested in DATs, and especially that's something that's not Bitcoin,
Yeah.
different alternate currencies? What's that outlook right now?
Yeah, great question. That really builds on, I think, what you had mentioned earlier about, there were so many DAT launches last year, and what differentiates you. Obviously, we've mentioned the Litecoin, we're an N of one. So we do get a little bit more attention than I would say a lot of the other ones that are out there. So it's interesting, but the institutional interest is definitely still there. And I think the active treasury management aspect is really what people are watching for. And I think if you couple that with some potential catalysts that are in motion as well in the crypto space, and I'm not just talking necessarily, it'll be nice to get the Clarity Act finally off people's desks in Washington, D.C. and have that out. The SEC obviously gave some guidance that was very helpful a couple of weeks ago. But I think once you get the clarity out, that will get rid of the final stages of the regulatory cloud that has been hovering over things. But I think there are some other things that are brewing out there too that potentially could have some very nice catalyst events to further drive the crypto market, and I think even potentially Litecoin in particular. But after so many DATs launched, and even after some that have come after Lits, like I said, no other Litecoin, we are an N of one. I'm super proud of that. Everyone has started to pivot to the speculative plays. And you kind of alluded to that too, right? Saylor, I will, applaud him to the days, I definitely am in awe of what he has built, and some of these other people have done some crazy things. But they've got into M&A, they've gotten into other stable coins. There's YouTube investments, and even jet engines. There are some random speculative plays that people have moved into, and frankly, that's just not our storyline. I'll never say never, but I don't see us going down that pathway. We are, like I said, are very focused on pushing forward the Litecoin ecosystem as itself. So those are fantastic. They're super interesting. And trust me, I'm sitting back and watching and seeing how they go, because someday we might want to expand, but that's not our play right now. Our focus continues to be, and what our story is on that institutional side, is this programmatic discipline and continuing to expand the Litecoin ecosystem. And I think that's really resonating with the institutional audience. When I have conversations on that side, they are very interested in how we're continuing to move forward in a very disciplined and thoughtful manner. And coupled with our ability to kind of lean into the strategic advisors that we have, we can start building something that is very meaningful. And even more importantly, debt-free. We don't have a lot of the other burdens that some of these other DATs have, with some of these more creative, we'll call it creative financing vehicles and other moves they've made that potentially make them a little bit more market risk sensitive to some of the downturns. Yeah. And basically, Litecoin has survived several bear markets, and I think we're positioned in ourselves to continue to push forward and do what we want to do, because we're staying in our lane and being very, very thoughtful. So, the institutional side is there. It'll be a very interesting year. I'd love to, let's reconnect no later than the end of the year, and let's see what the DAT kind of overall environment looks like, because I think you're going to see some changes, but we'll deal with that there. But I do think you'll still see us chugging along and making some good changes in the ecosystem for Litecoin.
100%. I think you answered up my next question. We usually ask DATs, we talk about all the upside, but we also have to talk about some of the risks and some of the risk vectors as well. But I think it's pretty kind of simple when it comes to a Litecoin DAT, where there's no debt, as you said, there's no debt free. There's no need to refinance anything. There's no liquidation price level where people have to worry about, and there's no kind of alchemy going on here. Uh, is there anything that else that people should know when it comes to the Litecoin that is maybe not talked about enough in terms of the structure, or anything that you want to kind of add final word?
Yeah, I think, and you're right. You summed it up perfectly. We're just a different animal in the sense of how we came to be and how we were birthed into the world of debts, right? No debt. We had existing cash on our balance sheet, and we had, with the structure that we were able to put together and the advisors we were able to put together, and being such a lean company, virtual company with low overhead, we were really able to lean into and focus on how we wanted to move forward. It's going to be very interesting to see, I think, how the year plays out and some additional opportunities that are on the horizon can really come into focus. And you'll definitely be hearing from us on how those are planning out. And I think it's just an exciting time, especially for Litecoin, that we can really lean into what I mentioned, that latent on-chain value, and we start unraveling that and kind of peeling back the onion a little bit. There are some potential avenues that I think are really going to be the catalyst that Litecoin needs to take off. Because it is undervalued, I think, in my opinion. And I think when you see the daily trading volumes and some of the activity, it perhaps gets a little ignored. And I think a lot of that is because people are discounting what that on-chain value is. So I think once some of these catalysts start occurring and start coming into focus, I think ultimately you'll see everyone's kind of attitude towards Litecoin start really picking up, and I think you're going to start seeing, some really good positive momentum as we continue into the year. It's an exciting time, to say the least. I'm super excited to be a part of the team. Like I said, it wasn't something I had on my bingo card if you would have asked me, a year or two ago, but it's certainly interesting. I get to meet some interesting people. I get opportunities to speak to you guys and kind of chat up and kind of dive into just the general environment, and it's just super interesting. It's hopefully it comes across. I'm very excited to be a part of the team and really push forward Litecoin and work with our company. So.
Or what I call crypto the best gardener of the internet. But yeah, Jay, this was awesome. I hope everyone learned more about what you guys are doing with Litecoin DAT. But before we go, one final question. Do you have any LTC price target for the year?
That is a great question, and I do, not a big surprise. I get asked that more than once. Sometimes several times or more during the week. I wish I could. My always standard response is if I knew where it was going, I would be retired and on a very nice island somewhere watching the world go by. I'm not a trader, I'm not a financial analyst, so I don't really give out prices. What I ultimately say, though, is let us execute on our disciplined approach and really look for these catalytic events and continue to roll out our very programmatic approach on how we're building Litecoin and the Litecoin ecosystem. And I think as we do that, not only will you see the shareholder value in Lits continue to develop, but you'll also see Litecoin itself continue to rebound and continue to grow in itself. And I think there's a lot of leg room there for both. And I think ultimately Liz is very well positioned to be a part of that and go along for the ride.
Awesome.
So yeah, it's a long story, yeah, but we're in it for the long, and we think that there's a ton of potential there.
Awesome. I think that's a great point to end it right there. Thank you so much, Jay, again for your time today.
You're very welcome. Yeah, we'll talk to you soon. Yeah, make it to Amsterdam.